We will send out the recording afterwards. So if you feel like you've missed anything, please know we will share this. We will also send additional supplemental material because we will be talking about a lot of different articles and just different resources that you can use today. So my name, if you don't know me already, is Kristen Sabalskis. I am Director of Engagement here at United Way. I've been with the organization for a little over 13 years, and I'm just very excited to have you all with us today. So thank you for joining. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Matt so he can introduce himself as well.
Kristen, my name is Matt Mailer. I'm a specialist with the engagement team here at United Way for Southeastern Michigan, and I've been here for nearly 4 years. It's great to see a lot of familiar names as well as some new ones. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Just so you all know, so I will be leading the training today, but Matt is going to be my right-hand man and helping monitor the chat. He'll be doing a lot of the breakout rooms and polls and all that good stuff. So I could not do this without him, but just wanted to mention that you may not see him on the screen, but he is there making sure his PowerPoint goes really well. So what we're going to start with is just some housekeeping items before we get into introductions and group norms. So today we are scheduled for 2 hours of training. I believe we'll probably end early. I don't think that we are going to take all 2 hours, but we will see. We do have 2 hours if we need it. There will be a 5-minute break halfway through just so everyone can use the restroom, get a snack, get water, walk around, do whatever you need to do. And we'll also have a few pretty simple share out activities, a breakout session, as well as a poll as well, so that we can break up the information. And so you don't have to just sit here and listen to me talk the entire time. So the first thing I want to do is I would love to just get a sense of who is in the room. So if you could take a minute to just share in the chat your name, the organization you're with, and your current role related to volunteer engagement. So if you all could go ahead and take a moment to do that, that would be great. Awesome. Thank you all so much. This is very exciting, especially as Matt mentioned, we recognize a lot of you, we interact with you a lot, but we also have a lot of new faces. And so thank you so much for joining us. We're excited that you're here today. Awesome. So while you all are doing that, I'm going to move to the next slide. So back in our first session, which was in June, we outlined some group norms for these meetings. So I'm going to review what we've already outlined, but if you have additional group norms that you would like to add to this list, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will make sure that they get in here for our next training session. So our group norms, make sure you mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Please treat others and our ideas with dignity and respect. Make space for everyone. Accept and respect discomfort because that is how we grow. And just remember that there's no such thing as a dumb question. Especially with volunteer management, there are so many different scenarios and just information out there on the best ways to manage and interact with your volunteers. And I know, looking around the room, there is a lot of different levels of experience and, tenure in the nonprofit world. So you may be brand new, you may be pretty seasoned, but hopefully regardless of your experience and your expertise, you will be able to take something away from today's training. So speaking of today's training, there are 4 modules that we are presenting. While these sessions do build upon previous sessions, they are standalone. So if you did not attend session 1 on organizational readiness, that's okay. You don't need to attend that in order to attend module 2. And that also applies for 3 and 4. You can pick and choose as you want to. However, we are recording all of these trainings. And so after this training is over, sometime in the next couple of days, I will share this training information, the training recording, but I'll also share the module 1 information in case you want to take a look at it, review it, or watch it for the first time. So module 1, which we did back in June, was on organizational readiness. Today, we are covering recruitment, placement, onboarding, and training. In October, we will be covering performance and relationship management. And then finally, in December, we will be covering continuous improvement. So that's kind of where we're going in terms of our training series. Now, again, reviewing from Module 1, our participants learned in June how to define volunteerism, speak to the importance of using volunteers, conduct a volunteer engagement assessment, identify support for volunteerism, identify resources for volunteerism, and they also learned how to measure volunteer engagement success. So as I mentioned, even if you were not able to make it to that training, we will send out that information in case you do want to review. So now we're going to do just a quick chat share. So I would love to hear from you all. What is one thing that you're hoping to learn in today's training session? So if you could just type that in the chat right now, just so we can kind of get a sense of what you're looking for. Awesome. Volunteer recruitment strategies, new and different recruitment ideas. Awesome. Best interview placement practices. Yeah, these are spot on. Best practices overall. Raising volunteer awareness of white privilege. Absolutely. How to recruit and keep a volunteer database. Awesome. You guys are bringing it today. So that's great. So what we'll be doing, and one thing I do want to just point out too, is a lot of times, the United Way, we are not necessarily the experts in every situation. And so one of the great things about today is we will have lots of opportunities for folks to share their own experiences. And so in all of these different things that you wanted to learn today, we will be covering those. And if we don't have the information that you're looking for, it's almost guaranteed that someone in this group does. And so that is definitely one of the things that we want to provide to you. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to cover today's objectives. So there are a lot of them. As I mentioned, there's a lot of content. So just bear with me as we go through it. So after today, participants will understand how to examine trends in volunteerism and how that might inform outreach, explore targeted recruitment concepts and consider potential audiences, develop an outreach strategy, define techniques for screening, interviewing, and matching volunteers with positions, describe the difference between and importance of orienting and training volunteers and staff, how to design an effective volunteer orientation, and then also how to assess training needs and design training to equip volunteers and staff. So like I said, quite a bit of information, but hopefully you will be able to take out some nuggets that you can apply back to your own work. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our first training topic, which is just covering some trends in volunteerism. So the next couple of slides in terms of trends are really coming from the Points of Light Foundation. So they recently did research, and these are the top motivators that volunteers said were their reasons for getting involved. So it enriches their lives, it sets an example for younger generations, it brings them joy, and it's an opportunity for them to pay it forward. So as you can see, a lot of these are very altruistic in nature. Now, this information was actually presented by an individual named Betsy McFarland at the 2019 Points of Light National Conference. So her group kind of discussed what today's volunteers are seeking. So they're looking for the chance to apply their talents and education to social concerns. They want to participate in designing their own volunteer work and projects, not simply just filling slots as unpaid staff. They want flexibility in when and how they give their time. They'd like the option to test drive the organization before committing long-term. And they sometimes are also looking to partner with staff rather than just be supervised, and to sometimes lead the effort if they have that expertise. Now, this is actually from Points of Light, and they did this during 2020, which I thought was interesting. So from the volunteer perspective, these are the things that makes a volunteer experience worthwhile. So you'll see there's several things on this list. So a worthwhile experience is discoverable, is local, credible, social, authentic, personal, impactful, and repeatable. So one of the things that I just really wanted to make clear after going through these trends, and this is from my experience, but I feel like you all have probably experienced it too, is not every volunteer is looking for these types of experiences. I would say for us at United Way, a lot of times young professionals are sometimes looking for more high level opportunities with your organization, more opportunities to collaborate and lend their expertise. But we also know that there are lots of folks out there that are happy to just come and pack food boxes for 3 hours once a week, and that is their contribution, and they're okay with that. So I did want to point out that even though these are trends, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is what we should be doing all the time. And that's really what this PowerPoint and this presentation is about, is really matching the right volunteers to the right opportunities and how you get those people in the door. And so while this list is full of great points that do make a worthwhile volunteer experience, I would say it's probably pretty unlikely that you are going to be able to do all of these things in one opportunity. It's just, don't strive for perfection, is basically what I'm trying to say, because I feel like this could potentially put a lot of pressure on you to design a perfect opportunity, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the work that we're all doing. So I just wanted to add that note as well. So when we're talking about trends, I do want to hear from you all, and you can either feel free to come off of mute and share verbally, or even just drop in the chat. But I want to kind of just take a moment for us to sit and think about the trends that we're seeing right now in our region. And if we were having this conversation back in 2019, it would look very different because we would not be in a global pandemic. And so I think this is a very relevant conversation to where we're at right now, with COVID-19, with folks, being a little bit nervous about their safety, in-person volunteering, virtual volunteering. So I would love to hear from you all. Who do you see is actually volunteering right now? What types of volunteers are volunteering? Why are they volunteering? And then how are they choosing to engage? So are you seeing certain types of folks who want virtual? Are you seeing certain groups of folks that are still comfortable doing in-person volunteering? I want to open that up to all of you. So if you could either drop in the chat or come off of mute and just share what trends you're seeing right now with the pandemic. Yeah, totally agree with that, Kelly. So Kelly said, people seem to be at two ends of the extreme, ready to get back in the game and do what is needed, and those who are still hesitant to engage face-to-face. And I would say that is pretty spot on for what we're seeing as well.
For whatever reason, my chat, oh, sorry.
Oh, this is Lori Weeks from Oakland Literacy, and I would say that we saw a large uptick in people who wanted to volunteer remotely because we offered that, particularly a lot of college students or young people doing gap years. They just had so many fewer opportunities that they were interested in engaging with us because we did offer something.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, Michelle Wagaman at Bound Together. It's definitely the case that younger people filled in the gaps where our retirees were much more reticent, both to obviously to engage in person, but also some of the online kinds of virtual work was something that people did not necessarily feel comfortable opting into. I guess one of the concerns right now is, as we look at hopefully being able to open back up, that's now been put at risk in the last several weeks. And so I think a lot of us are sort of feeling like we have to be ready to pivot back at this point.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, here at United Way, we're feeling that as well. I will share that for us, one of the biggest drop-offs we've seen is, and I feel like this is probably accurate for some of you as well, is we've seen a huge drop off in corporate volunteering in terms of group volunteering, which makes sense because a lot of folks have been told to work from home. Companies have been restricting what they can go out and do, especially in groups. So for us, our corporate volunteerism programs have been pretty quiet. If they are volunteering, they are building kits at home in the safety of their own home. So we are definitely seeing that as well. We've had a couple in-person projects, but really nothing like we've seen before. And yeah, like it's an interesting place to be in, especially at an organization like United Way, because, you know, we keep getting asked for best practices on what we should do during COVID times. And to be quite frank, we're figuring that out too. We don't have the answers. And essentially for us during the pandemic, our staff is still working remotely. We are not in the office. And so until that time, our volunteer staff here at United Way are not managing any in-person volunteer projects. If we do get volunteers who want to do something or a group, we do connect them with those of you that are doing in-person projects, but we pretty much are operating virtually right now. So I think that is definitely going, you know, just seeing how the trends are going and knowing we're going into cold and flu season, cold weather, people are going to be back inside again. It's definitely going to be interesting to see where all of this goes. So before I move on, does anybody else have anything they want to share?
Good morning. This is Auntie Nay from Auntie Nay's Village. I too have noticed that even though we usually get all types of volunteers, even those from other states, that due to COVID, we've had to downscale all the way around. We usually have a lot of virtual due to the colleges. We also have those that are face and person, but as of recently, what we usually have in a number of volunteers, we're down to at least maybe 5 or 10% of that. And that was even with our food pandemic delivery program, Stay Home, Stay Safe. Due to the lack of volunteers, even with that, we had to halt that program altogether. I'm hoping now that things are starting to open back up, we may be able to get many of our college students back. But like so many of you, our programs were contingent, and many of the grants that we received to run our programs were contingent on volunteers. And unfortunately, like so many, we had to stop and halt all of that due to the lack of volunteers. But what I have found is that those that have now gotten their shots, they are definitely looking to come back, and they're starting to come back in groups.
Thank you for sharing there. This is Matt from United Way again. And we've had a number of agencies come to us, as Kristen mentioned, looking for some guidance around, you know, how to engage with volunteers safely, what are volunteers comfortable with, what should we be comfortable with, how do we communicate what we're comfortable with to volunteers. One thing I want to mention as well, I think most of you have received this already in our agency newsletter, which Kristen sent out last week. There is a survey in that newsletter that asks about each agency's health and safety protocols and kind of what you're doing right now. If we'll send that again after this this training, but if all of you are able to fill that out, it gives a better sense of what people are doing, and then we'll also share the results of that with everyone at a later date, so that you can kind of see what your colleagues across the nonprofit community are doing. Since I know so many of us are looking to one another to try to chart a course forward. And of course, we know your protocols may be changing based on public health conditions, but I'd love to kind of get a snapshot of what those protocols offer you at this time.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, so I think all of us are pretty much feeling very similar in terms of what's going on with COVID and the pandemic, and, you know, really trying to figure out like what is safe, but also knowing that we're catering to folks that have different, just, you know, personal views on what makes them feel comfortable too. So as Matt mentioned, we do have that survey we'd love to get your feedback on, but we are also sharing that we've also developed a COVID volunteerism survey for our corporate partners. just to see where they're at, what they're going to be offering, what their restrictions are. And so we will also share that data with all of you, because I'm sure that would be really helpful just to see what corporations are thinking, what we know that there's a couple corporations that we partner with where everyone has to be vaccinated in order to participate. So there's a wide variety of different safety measures out there. So thank you all, and we can definitely continue this conversation later and also through email. So if there is any lingering questions or comments, feel free to reach out to Matt or I, or even after this, reply to the entire email stream, because we can definitely discuss this more within the group. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next section. So we're going to be talking about targeted volunteer recruitment. So first we'll go into what volunteer recruitment is, and this might seem a little simple, but that's okay. Just wanted to cover it. So volunteer recruitment is a process to attract and invite people to consider volunteer involvement with your agency, faith community, or organization. It is also the act of identifying groups and individuals for service and then actually asking them to volunteer. So while we're going to be focusing on targeted recruitment today, I did want to just provide kind of the two overarching types of recruitment, which you'll probably be familiar with both, but the first is warm body recruitment. So that is when you send a message to a broad audience. So that could be through your website, an email blast, your social media pages. And it's really not targeted to a specific type of volunteer, but rather just kind of to the general masses. And so this is really good, especially when you need a large number of volunteers, and even more so if you need a large number of volunteers in a short time period, which I know we've probably all experienced. But what we'll be talking about today is targeted recruitment. So sending a message to an audience who has the specific time, skills, and/or traits required for the position. So that might include previous volunteers, people who have experience with your organization. But again, a lot of times that might be looking for a specific group of folks that have a specific skill set. So when you're thinking about getting to know your audience and really figuring out who would be a good match for an opportunity, these are some questions you might want to ask as you're really working through that. So who is your target audience? What are the important features of the position? So the who, the what, the where, when, why, and how. What would appeal to that group about the position? So for example, if you identify that retirees are going to be your target audience, what about this opportunity would appeal specifically to that group? What are some possible barriers that group might face in accessing this opportunity and participating? What additional things do we need to know about the audience? So for example, if we are reaching out to retirees, doing so on social media, while that might be one way of doing it, might not be the best way. So it might be sending a mailer or, calling a couple groups or reaching out directly, just depending on the group that you're looking to engage. And then finally, what strategies should you use to reach your audience? So when we're talking about targeting our audience, you also want to think about, okay, so these are the populations of folks that I might want to target, but if I'm targeting these groups, who might I be missing? And so there's a lot of different groups and types of volunteers that we can reach out to, which we'll go over on the next slide. But one thing that I did want to point out is if we continue to target the same groups, we will continue to get the same homogeneous group of volunteers engaging with us. So one thing that we covered in session 1 of our training is just who makes up the typical volunteer pool. And a lot of times it is white people who are coming from the suburbs and are usually working with disadvantaged populations. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but as I mentioned, if we continue to reach out to the same groups or really kind of put ourselves in boxes of working with the same groups, then that will continue to get us the same homogeneous group of volunteers. And if we really are looking to further our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, we want to start thinking how to be more inclusive with our outreach and thinking of populations that we're missing based on what we've traditionally done. So taking a look, this is a non-exhaustive list of potential target audiences. These are very typical ones that I think we've probably all kind of outlined and used, especially when it comes to older adults, students, retirees, corporate volunteers, youth, millennials. I know a lot of us also use one-time or episodic volunteers quite a bit. And so this, you can use this list as a springboard, but I would encourage you again to really think outside the box of who are we missing that's not on this list? And if we are reaching out in these buckets, what folks are being missed because we're not getting the message out to them. And so that's how we, end up with a volunteer force that all looks the same or has the same background or experience. So just a couple things to think about when you're really identifying your target audiences. Now, the next section we're going to focus on is building your outreach strategy. So there's 4 components of building your strategy. The first is identifying benefits and features. The second is crafting a compelling message. The third is designing a communication strategy. And finally, step 4 is taking the action and actually marketing your message. So we're going to review each of these in a little bit more depth. So the first one we're going to start with is identifying the benefits and features. So the benefit is actually the benefit to the volunteer. So obviously you probably already have a sense of the benefit to your organization because you are saying this volunteer position is a need. We need folks to come in and do it. So what we're talking about here, especially in outreach, is really being able to communicate to the volunteer what benefits they will receive from volunteering. So that could be they might learn a new skill. Obviously they will have fun, they'll meet new people, they'll have an opportunity to network, but it also could be things like swag or a t-shirt. So just making sure that when you are reaching out to volunteers, you're sharing why this would be a benefit for them, not just them helping you, but also what do they get out of it as well. It's a two-way street. Now, when we talk about features, that's actually more about the volunteer position. So these are the descriptive elements of the volunteering task, such as the when, the where, what are you doing, who will you be doing it with, who is it benefiting, etc. So you want to kind of keep these 2 things in mind because a good outreach will show the volunteer why it's important, what impact it has, and what they'll get out of the volunteer opportunity. Now, step 2, crafting a compelling message. So again, this is kind of hammering the point home, but sharing those benefits and the features, keeping the message simple, and then also making the message attractive. So one thing that we all are aware of, especially living in such a social, like online virtual world, is that we are constantly bombarded with messages and information. And so one of the things you'll want to think about when you are reaching out to volunteers is what makes this opportunity compelling for this volunteer to get involved? What makes this opportunity different than other opportunities? And while it may be a very similar opportunity in nature to what other organizations are doing, the way you craft the message can really be the hook that get volunteers interested in your organization and volunteering with you. And also keeping it simple is important as well. So a lot of times what we will do at United Way is we will have our registration link online where they can actually take the action of signing up, and that has all of the information on it. So every single thing they need to know, where to show up, what information they need, what skills they need, what the benefit is, the impact on the community. But in the actual outreach strategy or outreach message that we send, we kind of shorten it down, keep it simple, really highlight the key points of the opportunity, and then get them hooked so that when they click on the link to learn more, that's where they can get all the information. Because if you are putting together a 4-paragraph email that really goes into detail every single thing a person needs to know about an opportunity, chances are folks are probably going to look at that and delete it or move on. So you want to kind of get them in and get them interested. And then once they take that action step of saying, yes, this opportunity sounds great, I'd love to learn more, then they can click on that link, they can reach out to you and really find out every single thing that they need to know about this opportunity. So one thing I want to spend just a little bit of time covering as well is just talking about barriers to volunteering. So there are a lot of them. I'm not going to go into each of these buckets, but you'll see here, these are some of the more common barriers to volunteering. So time, expected commitment, the cost, location or access to transportation, lack of childcare, unclear entry points, onboarding process, and unappealing opportunities. So there's just a lot of different things to consider. But one thing I want to know, and I actually think I had put this on a different slide, but I'm going to talk about it now. A big one that we see that comes up is expected commitment. So especially if an organization is having, let's say an 8-hour event, a lot of times it obviously on paper seems easier to recruit 4 volunteers for 8 hours versus breaking up that 4 hours into, that 8 hours into 2-hour shifts and then needing 8 volunteers. So technically you would need double the amount of volunteers if the shifts were shorter. But one of the things we always recommend is that an 8-hour shift is really difficult for most volunteers to commit to, especially if it is during the week. Because a lot of our volunteers, at least at United Way, do have full-time jobs. They may work with a corporate group. And so being able to commit to a total of 8 hours is a lot. And so even though it might be a little bit harder to fill all slots, you're more likely to fill slots if you're breaking down that commitment into smaller chunks of time that a volunteer is more likely to commit to. So it's just a very specific example, but it's something that we see a lot. So I recommend, when you are really determining your outreach strategy, taking a look at some of the barriers of that specific opportunity and thinking about the ways that you can get around those barriers.
We do have one question from the chat person from Kelly asking, what are the typical timeframes or lengths that most do?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
So, I hate to say it depends. Generally, we see if you're looking for volunteers to volunteer with your organization for the first time, the easiest entry point is a shorter time frame, even if it's for a single day even. So something about 3 to 4 hours. Going beyond that, it really does seem like a bigger commitment where, again, it'll be easier to have a single volunteer for a full day. But if someone is learning about an organization for the first time, sometimes they don't know what their experience is going to be like. So they really don't want to make that long-term commitment, whether it's a long time in a single day or long-term volunteer position. So similarly, if you are looking for someone to help out in your office, asking them to commit for a year up front might be a challenge, and it might be hard to bring in a volunteer. But if you can work with a volunteer, let's say on a trial basis for a few weeks where they work on a special project, that might help get them into your organization, get them in the door. And once they kind of get to know your organization, understand its mission, they may be open to that longer term commitment in the future. So if you're looking for a single day volunteer, 3 to 4 hours is probably the sweet spot. And if you're looking for a longer term volunteer, having them just commit for a few weeks is probably your best bet. Again, just to get them in the door, get them to know your organization, and hopefully you can grow that relationship in the future.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and I also wanted to just add too, obviously, there are some opportunities that will always require a longer term commitment, and that's okay. So for example, one of the opportunities we developed during the pandemic was our 211 volunteer program. So we actually train individuals to assist our 211 call center in taking calls that are specifically related to COVID, and also more recently related to the flooding that's been happening. And so for that type of opportunity, we require a 3-month commitment. And then they have the opportunity to continue signing on after that first 3 months is done. And so I know a lot of mentoring programs, require a more longer term commitment, and that's okay. We're not saying absolutely don't do that. But really it is thinking about who are you reaching out to and who's able to make that longer term or, full day commitment. Because if you're reaching out, for example, to college students, they might not be able to commit to something that's a year long, but they might be able to commit to something that's a semester or a month or a couple weeks or something like that. So it really, it really depends on the opportunity itself. And if you can break it down into smaller chunks, that does tend to work a little bit better with volunteer schedules, but also, we know that not every opportunity, can be designed that way. So that was a great question. Thank you for sharing that. So the next step is really designing a communication strategy. So the how step, this is how you are actually going to reach out to the target audiences that you identified. So different audiences require different communication styles. So we've kind of already touched on that, but I would imagine, that if we are going to be reaching out to our retiree group and also our young professionals group, we're probably going to reach out to those two groups a little bit differently, depending on how they've engaged with us in the past. So while our young leaders group or emerging philanthropist group responds really well to email communications, our retiree group may not respond in the same way, and that's okay. And so just knowing that different audiences require different communication styles is half the battle. And then also you want to be strategic about your communication. And so that can mean a lot of different things, but, again, going back to our young professionals group and our retiree group, we have kind of realized with our retiree group, they want all of the information up front. They want everything laid out for them. They don't care if it looks like 4 paragraphs, like they want all that information, because if they don't get that up front, they're 100% going to email us or call us and say, hey, I need more information on this. And then they'll have a bunch of questions. So a lot of times that type of group wants that information up front. Now with our young professionals group, we can, shorten the message, really get the main points across, and then they will take the next step usually to click on a link, read some more, and really identify if that opportunity is right for them. So it really just depends on the group that you're reaching out to. So one thing that we didn't go into and we're not going to cover, but I wanted to mention, and we'll send some resources afterwards, is talking about different motivation styles. So this even kind of goes beyond like kind of putting large groups in a box. So like retirees in general, motivation styles actually goes back down to like individual motivation. So in general, there are 3 different types of styles. So those are achievers, affiliators, and influencers. And all of them have a different kind of motivation for volunteering, and which means that the way you interact with them is going to be different. And so we'll send some information and some articles on like what that means and the definitions on those. But I just wanted to point that out that, especially if you're working with volunteers that are long-term volunteers with you and you're making an ask, say to an individual, you might want to think about that person's individual engagement with your organization and how they want to be communicated with. So finally, step 4 of this is where you market your message. So there are countless ways to get the word out about your volunteer opportunities. I'm going to cover a few of them here. But if there are any that you think are missing that are major ones, feel free to drop those in the chat. So the first is talking to current volunteers, staff, and board members. So a lot of times it is really easy, or not really easy, but easier to get commitments from folks who are already bought into your mission, rather than reaching out to folks that maybe have never heard of your organization or understand what you do. So being able to talk to those folks that are already bought in and asking them to volunteer usually has a higher success rate than reaching out to folks that you haven't interacted with before. Also, harnessing word of mouth marketing and the personal ask is another great way. So some of your biggest supporters and biggest advocates are folks that are already engaged with your organization, and chances are they would be happy to even reach out to their own personal networks on your behalf to see if they can help you recruit volunteers. I know that that is a really prevalent thing with our retiree group. If you ask them to share the word or really ask them to do anything, they tend to be pretty motivated, and they tend to also be very well connected. And so word of mouth can be really great, especially if you're utilizing folks that already have bought in, who are ready, your biggest advocates essentially. And one thing that, we think a lot about as well is you have to make the ask. So a lot of people, including donors, maybe they've never volunteered before, but also they've probably never been asked. So making sure that you're reaching out to all your stakeholders and saying like, hey, this opportunity is here for you, because a lot of times we don't ask, but if we did make a direct ask either to give or to volunteer, a lot of times folks are going to say yes. It's just because we didn't ask, so they didn't take action. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind as well. So this is obviously a little bit different with COVID happening, but so setting up a booth at local events, farmers markets, festivals. I know in normal times, sometimes there are like volunteer fairs or fairs at like local universities where you can go and have a booth. So that's one way to market your message. You can distribute brochures or posters, any kind of literature to other organizations in your community where folks can pick that up and take a look at it. Making public service announcements on TV, radio, or online. Speaking to community groups. So, maybe the churches or neighborhood associations around where your organization operates. A lot of times we will see that folks that have benefited from the resources of your organization are also folks that are very eager to give back when they're able to, or at least share the word with the folks that they know. So this is a really great way to reach your own community and your own neighborhood. And obviously posting online and leveraging social media are two really important ways to kind of get the word out. And they tend to be pretty simple and far reaching just because of the ease of technology. And so speaking of online recruitment, obviously we have United Way's volunteer portal, which hopefully you're a part of. If you're not, please reach out to Matt or I after this, and we'd be happy to get your organization set up. So our volunteer portal is a great place to post your volunteer opportunities. If you're familiar with us, we also try to offer a lot of supplemental, resources and trainings like this one, so that it's not just you posting. We can also highlight your opportunities, in our monthly volunteer newsletter, on our social media pages. And we're also happy. One thing that we offer that I don't think a lot of folks are aware of is if you need just kind of brainstorming assistance or comment, just want to pick our brains about like how to recruit or how to build a specific volunteer program, we're also happy to do that as well. So we do try to offer a lot of other resources in addition to offering our volunteer portal online. But we're not the only volunteer portal out there. And I'm not ashamed to say that, the more you post, the more you get your word out, because the audience that is using our volunteer portal may not be the same audience that's using Volunteer Match. And so that's another great thing that you can take a look at is other volunteer websites that are out there where you can post your volunteer opportunities. So I just wanted to plug that as well. And then when you think about social media, a lot of our organizations are probably already tapped into Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But you may not have thought about using YouTube, LinkedIn, or Nextdoor. So those are some really interesting places where you could connect with people that you maybe necessarily haven't done before. And one thing I'll mention too is, so here at United Way, I'm not sure how it is for everyone else, but at United Way, we don't have direct access to our social media pages, and that's done through our marketing department. However, in my experience, they're always looking for content to post because they don't want to just be posting the same things. And so they are almost always more than happy to post volunteer opportunities or information from us on social media. So if you're not already connected to your organization's marketing team, I would definitely recommend doing that, because anytime that they can get additional content that they don't have to create themselves, they tend to be really appreciative of. And so it's really a win-win situation for you, your organization, and your marketing team. And so I know that, we've been talking a lot about recruitment strategies and, matching recruitment strategies with certain groups, but I want to hear from you all what you found to be your most successful recruitment methods. So we'll take a few minutes here. Please drop in the chat or come off of mute just to share where you have seen the most success. And this can also be pre or during COVID. So yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Kristen. This is Alfonso from Streetwise Partners. We've seen the most success on having our current volunteers help us recruit other volunteers through like a social media takeover event and things like that. So word of mouth is definitely key.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I bet. And that's a really great idea of having a social media takeover. I might actually have to write that one down. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, looks like in the chat too, word of mouth is amazingly good when volunteers are engaged. Does anyone else have any examples they want to share?
So this is Rachel Mannion Cox. So we deal with a lot of like corporate volunteers and groups like Jack and Jill of Detroit Ministries. So it's pretty much, we're connected with the word of mouth is it for us. So what we do is we always get one person out of the groups or the corporate groups and have them like the manager or the captain of the volunteers. And when I tell you, we have so many volunteers just through them. And, you know, because they got a duty, they feel like they're needed. So we have to do this. We have to get out here and, you know, advocate and get these volunteers. So it's pretty much through our volunteers.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that is definitely makes your life so much easier when you can identify one person within a group that will absolutely champion getting folks to sign up.
It's been amazing.
Yep. Because there is, while it seems, I feel like the way I'm going to say this might seem shady, but it's not, I promise. But it's like, you know, being part of a group myself, I was in a sorority in college. If my friends are doing it, I am more likely to also do it. I'm also more likely to show up and not cancel last minute if I feel like people are counting on me. So that commitment and that responsibility of like peer to peer of following through on an activity is something you could absolutely bank on. So that is great. Thank you for sharing that. And I just wanted to point out what Allison said in the chat as well. So reaching out to local established volunteer groups, colleges, high schools, you know, especially with specific majors, clubs, programs, etc. Yeah, absolutely. One thing that we here at United Way have been trying to do a better job of is even connecting with more grassroots volunteer organizations. So we are working on reaching out to more faith-based communities, especially like sororities, fraternities, you know, volunteer groups. There are a lot of local volunteer groups because these folks are motivated, they are wanting to give back, and they already exist. It's just we haven't tapped into those sources yet. So that's definitely an area that I would recommend reaching out to that we're currently working on. So before we move on, does anyone else have anything else to share? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I feel like I'm just really happy that we're all sharing today, and we've had such great tidbits of information. I really appreciate everyone that's shared their perspectives today so far. So this is the last part of this section, and it's really just super quick. So one thing that we don't do at United Way, but now I kind of want to figure out how we can do this, and you may already be doing this as an organization, excuse me, is tracking your referral sources. So if you've ever interacted with an organization, you might get a feedback survey or, you know, a follow-up survey via email that says, how did you hear about us? Or how did you hear about this volunteer opportunity? That is a really great way to figure out which one of your outreach strategies is most effective. So if you have, you know, volunteers who come in person and you have them fill out a quick survey when they arrive or even when they leave, where they can indicate like, this is how I found out about you. Or if you send an electronic survey after, those are just great ways for you to say, oh, the majority of these volunteers said that they heard it from this email blast or from a friend or from Facebook. And then that way it will help you kind of narrow down which strategies are working best, and will even allow you.
The beginning of the script is about our event, so people can totally ignore that because it's like, can you attend on August 12th? So you don't need to.
I think we need to.
Just that first question, people can.
Okay, I don't think that was related to us, so sorry about that. But yeah, so being, having that information up front helps you kind of figure out where you can even kind of be pooling your resources. So if you're realizing that like you've put a lot of resources into email blasts, but everybody is showing up because of a Facebook post, you might want to do more Facebook posts and less emails, for example. So that's kind of simplifying it, but that is one thing that we here at United Way have not done, but I think would be really interesting. So yeah. So we are now at the point where we're going to take a 5-minute break. So it is 10:54. If we can come back, we'll just say 11. Let's make it an even 6 minutes, just because I'm not great at time or adding. So we're just going to do 11 o'clock. So feel free now to take a break, go get some water, use the restroom, do whatever you need to do. And I will see you all back here in 6 minutes at 11 a.m. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with the second half of our training today. So now we're going to talk more about the intake and screening process. So one of the things that you really want to take a look at before you kind of identify, certain aspects of how you're going to interact with volunteers is kind of the basics. So what happens currently when potential volunteers contact you? So what happens if they email or call you directly? What if they reach out to someone else in your organization or your organization's main line? What if they use an online form? So there's a lot of different ways that an individual volunteer can get connected with you, and you want to kind of think through what the steps are, regardless of where they're coming in. And you want to make sure that that process is very clear and concise for the volunteers so that they don't feel like they have to hunt a person down just to get the information that they're looking for. Another thing to consider is your response time. So does it take you 5 minutes to follow up with a volunteer, 24 hours, 48 hours, a week? What is that response time? One thing that I wanted to touch on here, so at United Way, our timeline that we try to follow up with volunteers is within 48 business hours. Usually we can do that sooner, but that's really the time frame that we're operating within. But I did want to mention that while you might see different resources recommend a specific amount of time, it really depends on your organization's needs. So if you can't reasonably say, we're going to follow up with a volunteer within 24 hours of them reaching out, that's okay, but you still need to identify what your best practices are for that. And one thing, this is a very specific example, but one thing that can be really great, especially if, the best way for a volunteer to email you is reaching out to, like a generic email inbox, is even setting up a out of office response that says, thanks so much for reaching out to us. You will hear back from us within this time frame. If this is an emergency or urgent need, please contact us at this phone number. So really it's more about setting expectations with volunteers of what they can expect versus trying to adhere to an unrealistic standard that somebody else set up for you. So please feel free, like you have the autonomy to outline the best practices for your organization. Even if United Way does something a certain way, doesn't mean that it will work for your organization, but it really just is about communicating clearly to the volunteer and setting those expectations up front. And then finally, what's the next step for interested volunteers? So once that volunteer contacts you and they're like, yeah, I'm interested in XYZ opportunity, what are the next steps? What we try to do at United Way, and I can send examples if anyone's interested, is we actually create almost like an onboarding visual for every opportunity that we have. So if you reach out to us for this specific opportunity, here are the steps. The volunteer registers online, they get an automatic confirmation email. This staff member who is in charge of this specific volunteer program will send them an email with more information and next steps. And then we outline the United Way steps as well as the volunteer steps so that not only can we communicate to the volunteer what their next steps are and what they can expect from us, but it also keeps us as staff on track of what we're supposed to be doing in order to provide a quality volunteer experience. So these are 3 questions that you really should have the answers to and have documented internally so that you can provide a great experience, but also it's just a much easier process for you as staff as well. Yes, thank you, Alfonso. I will absolutely send some of our process documents so you can kind of see what I'm talking about, because I think it would be really beneficial. Okay. So going more into intake and screening techniques. So these next couple slides were technically supposed to be part of a activity, but I think that might be a little bit too involved for what we're doing today. So I definitely would encourage you to do this activity on your own for your own work, or even with your own team. So here on the screen, you can see typical intake and screening techniques along with the definition of what they are. So a lot of these are probably very familiar to us. So there's the application, the interview, consent forms, reference checks, license check, background check, orientation, and training. And then I will not read through the definitions, but you can read through that on your own. So the activity is actually taking this kind of setup and outlining what the benefits and challenges would be for your organization or your department for each one. So one thing I want to mention is not all of these techniques are necessary for every opportunity or organization. It really depends on the type of opportunity, as well as what your resources are and your capacity is. So for example, with our 2-on-1 program, which I mentioned before, our volunteers complete an online registration form, which is kind of like an application, but not really. And then what they do is we automatically have them complete a background check. They have to pass a background check because they are working one-on-one, answering phone calls with the community. Once they are cleared with that background check, then they go through 3 hours of training as well as a quiz so that we can make sure that they have the knowledge and feel prepared to be able to complete that volunteer activity in a successful way. That is not required for all of our volunteer opportunities. So for example, if we set up a corporate project out at a community garden, we're not going to, unless the agency requires it, typically for a one-time, 3-hour volunteer opportunity where they're not interacting with any vulnerable populations, we're not going to require them to do a background check. However, we will still do an orientation and training, but that will look a lot different because it'll be shorter, it'll be on site versus a 2-on-1 program where they have to go through extensive training because of the nature of the opportunity. So this would be a good exercise for you to figure out, okay, what would be the benefits of us doing this specific technique? And if we were to do it, what challenges would we face? And then this next slide, this really just touches on the order in which you do these things. So you might do it in this order. So for example, you might have them apply, you might interview them. And then once you do the interview and you're like, yeah, I think this volunteer would be a great fit, you have them do all these different forms, they do a background check, and then they attend training. However, some of these things can be reordered depending on how you want to set up your volunteer structure. So a good example that I like to use is the background check. So the background check, I have seen some organizations. So for example, us here at United Way, with our 2-on-1 program, we automatically have every volunteer go through a background check when they say they're interested in the 2-on-1 volunteer program. To us, it makes sense, and we have the resources and the capacity to be able to background check those volunteers up front. And then we know if they pass their background check, then they've passed that part of screening and we can move them on to the next step. However, if you are a smaller organization with limited resources, you may not be able to pay for a background check for every single person who's just showing interest. So what I have seen with other organizations is that they may do an application and interview first and identify if that volunteer is a good fit. And then if they are deemed a good fit, then they have them do the background check. And that's okay. It depends on your organization's priorities, your resources, your capacity, and it's okay if you do things differently than other organizations do. And so that is one thing I wanted to point out is, going through this, you can identify which ones would be best for your organization or a specific opportunity, but then even knowing that you can play with the order of how you do things, just depending on what your priorities are. So we can do another quick share here. Feel free to just drop this in the chat, or if you would like to come off mute, you're more than welcome. But if you have any specific factors that determine the intensity of your volunteer screening, I would love to hear what those are. So here at United Way, anytime that volunteers are working with vulnerable populations directly, especially one-on-one, those volunteer opportunities require background checks. So I mentioned the 2-on-1 program. Back in April, we also had volunteers who did virtual book readings in classrooms. So we had those volunteers get background checked as well. But I would love to hear if any of you have specific examples of when you do or don't use specific techniques, depending on the situation. Okay, I'm going to say, oh, we do have something great. We do background checks for volunteers that are handling potentially sensitive information about our clients. Absolutely. That definitely makes sense.
We do background checks for volunteers that's going to our daycare, dealing with the children. So yeah, and then like administrative work. So we really do an intense background check.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yep. And I'm also seeing in the chat, requiring a background check for those working directly with clients, doing presentations or outreach to or with minors, handling financial information. It's important to train on the importance of online best practices when we're working with children online. Absolutely. Yep. And then working with vulnerable populations, we do background checks on all volunteers. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a pretty typical standard. I think that most of us have, so that definitely makes sense. Yep, sex offender screening, social security number trace for those working in YMCA facilities or working with children. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing all that. Okay, so what we're going to cover next is the interviewing and matching process. So I kind of combined a few slides here because I thought they all kind of got to the same point. So your position description that you've outlined for the position that you're recruiting for, as well as a volunteer application and volunteer interview, can help you with these specific points. So it will help you confirm that the volunteer has the necessary qualifications. It helps ensure that the volunteer understands their expectations. It provides space for the volunteer to share why they are interested in the position in your organization. It informs the type and amount of support the volunteer may need in that position. It helps you develop a relationship with the volunteer. It helps them learn more. And then it also allows the applicant, the volunteer, and also you as the interviewer to determine whether or not this volunteer would be a good fit for the specific position. I know a lot of times, and you can, if you've done any sort of professional interviewing for actual openings in your own organization, a lot of these techniques are the same and it follows the same principles. But a lot of times, we've experienced where a volunteer will apply for a position and then we interact with them and realize that they're probably not a good fit for that position, but they actually may be a better fit for a different one. And so that's something that can be really helpful when you are learning about a volunteer for the first time, especially if you're doing an interview, is you can say, I think that this opportunity may not be the best fit. However, I can redirect you to this opportunity where I think, this would better match what you're interested in or your skill set. And one, very basic example is if you are interviewing a volunteer that's going to be a greeter or a front desk worker at your organization, you probably want that volunteer to be friendly, to be confident, probably a little bit more extroverted, someone who is not afraid to greet folks as they come in, make eye contact, and readily engage that individual in conversation. You probably don't want an individual who is more introverted, is not as comfortable interacting with folks one-on-one, and maybe is just less comfortable in a social setting. And so a lot of times, even in kind of one-day events, we've had volunteers that we were going to place as greeters or as folks that were interacting with students or with, groups of folks and realized this is probably not the best fit for them. And so a lot of times, interacting with that volunteer ahead of time, especially in an interview process, will really help you determine whether or not that volunteer is a good fit for the position that they applied for. Continuing with interviewing and matching, this kind of relates more to when a volunteer is in your physical environment, which may not be as relevant right now, but is still really great to consider, especially if we ever go back to a place where we're all in person again. But considering physical environment expectations, so making sure that in an interview, you're providing information about how to find the office, what's the appropriate attire that they should wear, going through cultural norms of your organization. So, how formal or casual is the environment in your office? Will they be, interacting with other staff or other volunteers? And just making sure that they understand what they're bringing to the situation and what kind of culture they're coming into. And then again, we will send more information about this afterwards, but again, this is a great place to look at individual motivation styles because different types of folks will by nature be better for different types of opportunities, especially if they are more externally or internally facing. Now, when it comes to the actual interview process, again, a lot of these things, if you have done any sort of professional interviewing for your work, for your department, these are going to sound really familiar. So who should and can be involved in the volunteer interviews? So obviously, the very most obvious choice is the volunteer manager. You might have some key staff members. So they may be in your department, they may be in a different department, but folks that are going to be interacting with this volunteer on a regular basis would be very great to have in the interview process. You may decide you want to have current volunteers. So you may have some volunteers that are long-term, really understand your culture, understand what it means to be a volunteer, and could serve as, a great screening opportunity. Even underrepresented groups. So really that means like one of the things we do at United Way when we do interviews, even if it's for a position on the volunteer team, we will pull in a couple other members of different departments just to have a cross-departmental, like unbiased perspective of that individual that we're looking to hire. So even if they are not super familiar with our volunteer space or our work, knowing what they know about our department, about how our team operates, it can be really helpful to have an outside perspective when thinking about if that volunteer is going to be a good fit, not just for the position, but also the culture of your organization. And then in some instances, you may want to have a panel interview. That is pretty intense for some folks, but it could depend on the opportunity that you're offering them. And it might make sense to have just a few different folks in that interview as well. And then in terms of what to cover in an interview, you'll want to focus on the volunteer's inspiration. So why are they wanting to volunteer with you? What about your organization and the position is interesting to them? What do they like to do in terms of interest in their free time? What types of opportunities are most interesting to them? What kind of constraints do they have? For example, they're only available on weekends, or they're afraid of heights, or there might be some, maybe they have a weight limit in terms of what they can lift. So really identifying what those constraints are so you can make sure that the opportunity that they're matched to really is of interest to them and matches, what they're actually able to do for you. Their working style. So is it someone who prefers to be given a project and they complete it on their own, or is it someone who would prefer to interact with clients and staff and other volunteers and really have that social aspect? Looking at their specific skills. So for example, we have had folks in the past that have volunteered for kind of specialized opportunities, like for example, like a financial opportunity, and then found out that they really didn't have any experience. And so they weren't a great fit for that. So just making sure that the opportunity that the volunteer is interested in, they actually have the skills for. And if not, you may provide that. It's up to your organization if you do provide the training on those skills. And then finally, discussing expectations, not just of what the volunteer can expect from your organization, but what you expect from the volunteer. And this is really important, especially as you go forward, because if you're not clear on mutual expectations, that is when you may run into some issues, especially when it relates to performance management. So making sure that everyone is on the same page, the volunteers understand exactly what's expected of them and what they can rely on you and your organization for as they move forward with their engagement. And then this is just a quick slide. These are things that like you don't think you have to say, but we do just in case. So this is a non-exhaustive list of things of what not to do or ask during an interview. And this relates to, job interviewing as well. So age, birthplace, weight, marital status, religious affiliation, race, sexual orientation, or anything not directly related to the volunteer position. So now we're going to head into the next section, which is just an introduction first to orientation and training. And then we will go a little bit deeper into each of those. So first, I want to outline the difference between orientation and training. And I will say United Way, our staff is very guilty of using these terms interchangeably when they don't actually mean the same thing. So orientation really is introducing volunteers to your organization and its volunteer engagement initiative. So really think of orientation being an introduction to your organization and the broad volunteer opportunities that you offer. So this is like big picture, what we do, our mission, our vision, and here are our volunteer opportunities. Training, on the other hand, is providing individuals with the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that they need to effectively perform specific roles or duties. So one thing I wanted to point out with this too is these can be separate or they can be combined. So I know some of our partners will offer, for example, like a monthly volunteer orientation where anyone can drop in. It's basically an information session, and it's kind of just come get to know us. You'll learn what we offer. And then if you're interested in signing up for something, we'll give you next steps for specific volunteer opportunities. And then once a volunteer signs up for a specific volunteer role, then that is when they will get that training that will actually teach them how to do the role that they've signed up for. I will say for us at United Way, it depends on the volunteer opportunity. But if we are bringing a group, like I said earlier, out to a community garden, we're going to combine the orientation and training into one pretty short, pretty simple overview. So we're going to say, we're from United Way. This is what United Way does in a nutshell. This is why we're partnering with this organization. You know, a lot of times we'll give the other organization opportunity to talk about their mission. And then we're like, here's what you're doing today. And then we get them started. But again, depending on the type of opportunity and the nature of the opportunity, these two things might be different, and you might require more extensive training depending on what the volunteer will be doing. So we are going to take a quick poll that Matt is going to bring up. And so I would just love to see what you all are doing in terms of orientation and training. So if you could take a minute to answer, there are a few options. So how are orientation and training happening at your organization? The options are they aren't happening, we want to, but who has time for that? We do orientation, but not training. We do training, but not orientation. We do orientation and some training, but not consistently. We do them as needed on the fly. And then finally, we have developed and delivered orientation and training tailored to the requirements of the specific volunteer roles. So I'm just going to give that a few more seconds. Okay. That's awesome. So far, it looks like a lot of you do have developed orientation and training, which is awesome. I will say that is not something at United Way. I would probably answer, and I don't know if Matt would answer the same way, but I would probably say we do orientation and some training, but not consistently. I guess not. I guess we do them regularly, but because of the nature here at United Way of us working out in the community with other agencies so often, ours is a little bit different. And so it really depends on the opportunity. But I love to see that, you know, across the board, there's a lot of folks in here with a lot of different experiences. And I think that's great. I think that's awesome. So hopefully you're, you know, regardless of where you're at on this poll, all of you are finding something beneficial in today's training that you can kind of take back and, you know, edit into your own work. So thank you for that. I don't know if anybody could see the results, but I just shared them in case anybody wanted to take a quick look. Awesome. All right. Thank you all so much. So we are actually going to do a group breakout activity. So I'm going to go over what this means. And then if we have any questions, feel free to come off mute or jump in the chat, and then we'll send you to breakout rooms. So Matt, do we have enough folks to do 5 breakout rooms, or do we need to do a smaller group?
I think we could do 5, yeah.
Okay, cool. So essentially you're going to be broken into a group with some other folks. Depending on the number that you're in, you will have one of these questions. So once you get into your group, you will answer the question that you're assigned to with the members of your group. So identify one person to kind of keep track of the answers to your specific question. We'll give you 5 minutes to brainstorm, and then we'll bring you all back and we'll ask each group to share their top 3 to 5 answers that they came up with for each of the questions. Does that make sense? I'm not great at explaining things, so I wanted to make sure that made sense. Okay, so once we get you into your rooms, Matt is actually, he's probably doing it right now. So sorry, Matt, if I'm stealing your thunder. He is going to copy and paste each question. So for example, if you're in group 1, you will be answering question 1. If you are in group 2, you will be answering question 2, and so on and so on. So Matt, do you have anything to add before we go into breakout groups?
Chris, it might be helpful if you just explain the difference between questions 4 and 5.
Oh, okay.
Key components of volunteer training versus what staff. So what do we mean by staff training
Yes.
versus volunteer training?
Yeah, absolutely. So number 4 is focus on training volunteers. So I feel like that part is pretty straightforward. But in number 5, when we're talking about staff training, so this is something we covered a little bit more extensively in session 1, is training staff on how to interact with volunteers. And so that is really the difference. If you are in group 5, what are key components of training staff, that the things that the staff need to know in order to work with volunteers and provide a good, effective volunteer experience?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
So in a moment, you'll be sent to a breakout room. There'll be a window that pops up on your screen that says you're being sent to breakout room 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just look for that number, and that will help indicate what question we're asking your group to ask. And we'll pop around just to make sure that you know what's going on. So just a moment, you'll be sent to your room. Again, in the chat, we have sent these 5 questions as well as the definitions of orientation and training. And you should be sent there in just a moment. And yeah, we'll give you a 60-second warning before you come back. But again, if you can, pick someone that can give some of those answers, whether in the chat or out loud, once we come back to the main group, that would be appreciated. Thank you, everyone.
All right, Matt, does it look like we have everyone back?
Yes, we're all set.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Hopefully you all found that beneficial, just to engage with each other and answer the questions. So as Matt shared, I would love to hear what each group did. So I'll call on each group. So if someone could either come off mute to share what you discussed or even drop in the chat, that would be great. So let's go ahead and start with room 1, question 1. I feel like maybe someone is typing in the chat because nobody's come off mute yet. So I'll give you a second. So if someone from group 1 can share.
Just to Sharon, I think I was part of group 1, and we was just basically talking about in the group I was in, we was talking about how important like orientation and training is. So maybe that wasn't group 1.
Yep, that is actually, yep, that's group 1.
Yeah. And we was just saying how it was important just to make sure that the volunteers like fit in and everything like that. So yeah, and we all pretty much thought the same thing of making sure that they were a good fit for the work.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move to group 2. What are the consequences of not doing orientation and training? Would anyone like to share from group 2?
Yeah, this is Lori Weeks. We all agreed that the common word would be that it would be a disaster, that our volunteers would have a lot of questions of staff all the time. We might have some volunteers going rogue and doing what they think the position should be that doesn't really align with the goals and the mission. And we would have a hard time developing the empathy that our volunteers need to have to serve the populations we serve.
Absolutely. I was on mute, so you didn't hear me laugh at the disaster part, but I totally agree. And I think we've all had volunteers go rogue, even in the best of circumstances. So absolutely. Yeah, if the volunteers don't receive the information that they need, not only are they probably going to be asking you questions every minute, but you're also probably going to be having to correct what they're doing on a regular basis because they just don't know how to do those things. So thank you very much for sharing. That's spot on. All right, let's move to group 3. What are the key components of orientation? So what components did you all discuss in group 3?
This is Jackie. We talked a lot about orientation being dependent on the type of volunteer opportunity. So depending on their role, that will dictate the type of orientation that they have. But really what we want to see in that orientation is a connection to the mission, as well as the importance of what it is that they're doing and how their volunteer function fits into the overall good that we're producing. We had someone that does a video-based orientation that I thought was really interesting. And someone else has a tip sheet that goes out to project managers so that they have some talking points for orientating volunteers.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's great. Those are all really fantastic points. I appreciate you all discussing that and sharing that with the group. All right, let's go ahead with group 4. What are the key components of volunteer training?
Yeah, and if anyone in my group wants to chime in, feel free to do so. But we mainly talked about how a prerequisite should be that there is already an orientation that has happened or is going alongside the training, because then, yeah, they won't really have a connection to the mission or to the organization. It might just be to the project, and that's, you know, not the same thing. We talked about how if there's any other prereqs that need to be done either before or after, like background checks or additional trainings, like we have a training that's for the actual program, and then we have a training that's for DEI as well. Making sure expectations and responsibilities are clearly communicated. And then a couple things that I kind of thought of after we left the breakout rooms were doing maybe like troubleshooting, tips and tricks, best practices, things like that. I think it's really helpful depending on what it is that you are doing to do like either role playing or some kind of like scenario that would be common for the volunteers to, you know, kind of encounter, and then who to connect with if they have any questions, if they, you know, need help with something, and if there's like a checkout process or an ending process.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. There are so many awesome components to that I think, you know, we didn't necessarily touch on today. So I love that, especially the DEI training. Just as a quick note, that is something that we are researching even at United Way, is how can we, like, I mean, we don't do DEI training really. And so really looking at how to implement that, not just for volunteers that are doing like long-term opportunities, but all opportunities. So thank you so much for sharing. That sounded like it was a great discussion. Finally, we're going to move on to group 5. So what are the key components of staff training?
I can share a couple notes from our conversation. So one of the things we talked about was kind of outlining to staff the different volunteer groups and what their, or populations, and what their different skills, requirements, and limitations are, so that they kind of understand how to manage those different groups or what activities they'd be most useful for. And then another thing we discussed was actually training staff on management of volunteers, like how to lead a group, how to engage a group, and just different components of staff management, to be honest. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That actually is a really great segue into our next slide. So I'm going to touch a little bit more on staff training, but thank you so much. Those are all great things, especially managing expectations with staff, making sure that they understand why the volunteers are there, how to interact with the volunteers. And those of you that did not attend our first session, we go over that a little bit in more detail during that session. So feel free to check that out as well. And I see we have a question in the chat. So what is DEI training? So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so those trainings can look different depending on the population that you're engaging or the work that you're doing. But essentially it is training volunteers around how to interact with different populations, especially if they are working with disadvantaged populations and the volunteer themselves is white. But also it helps them kind of like take a look at their own privilege, really kind of see like from their perspective how different their lives may be from those that they're serving, and just how to properly like interact with folks that may be on a different path than them. Which I know that was not a super eloquent way of saying that, but there's a lot of different components that can be within DEI training, and there's a lot of different ways to deliver it. So if that's something folks are interested in, that's something we are researching at United Way to kind of implement in our own work. So I'll be happy to share that information with you all as well as we learn those things. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Thank you all so much. I think that was, I love being able to connect you all with each other. Even though, we have knowledge and experience at United Way, I think a lot of us just are all content experts in different ways. So I'm glad that you all had an opportunity to connect and share that information with each other. So going on more with your role as a volunteer manager. So obviously it is up to you and your staff and your team to ensure that volunteers receive adequate orientation and training across the organization. But going back to staff training, so one of the things we can't recommend highly enough, if you're able to do it, is training non-volunteer staff on how to give orientation and trainings. So a great example that we use at United Way is in normal times, we can have anywhere from 10 to 20 corporate volunteer projects out in the community, out throughout Southeastern Michigan in 1 week. And even though we do have kind of a larger staff of volunteer folks, we don't have the capacity to be at every single project. And so what we have done is we've actually trained our fundraising staff to go out and lead volunteer projects on our behalf. So they are able to go out, they can give that brief orientation of what United Way does, which for those folks, that's easy to them because they're fundraisers. So they're already used to talking about that. But they're able to go out to this agency site, work with the agency to manage the volunteers that day, give a quick training, and just make sure the volunteer project goes well. So that is definitely something that we recommend you do, just because it's a helpful resource, especially when you have limited capacity. So so this is just a quick quote about orientation. So orientation is a process of making volunteers feel comfortable with and understand the workings of the organization, and letting them understand how they can contribute to the purpose of the organization. So again, that's just a really great way. And I think one of you mentioned it might have been Chelsea, potentially, when we were sharing feedback, is that if a volunteer receives training but doesn't receive the overall big picture orientation, they might become attached to that opportunity, but not your organization. And if they don't understand the impact that they're making to your organization and the community and able to make that connection, they may not come back. That may not form a strong enough connection with your organization. So orientation is really important. So volunteer orientation, there are 3 elements that you want to incorporate. So the first is the why. So why should I volunteer here? This is when you want to go over the mission and purpose of your organization, as well as going over how volunteers fit in the big picture. the how and the what. So how might I volunteer here? What would I do? This is where you can talk more about position descriptions and expectations, as well as your organization and volunteer engagement structure and systems. So how things work, what the processes are, how they get involved, next steps. And then also the who. So who are the players and where does the volunteer fit in? So who will they be working with? Will they fit in with the culture? And does leadership and other staff care about volunteers? And so that right there is another important reason why doing volunteer training with staff is so important. It's just really making sure that the staff understands why the volunteers are there, but also they in turn make volunteers feel welcome and that they're part of the organization. So other considerations you want to think about for your volunteer orientation. So, you definitely want to outline your goals. So maybe outlining 3 to 5 goals of what you want to accomplish for your orientation. Identify what the tone of the orientation will be. Should it be more serious or fun, more formal or casual? And then also when and where should you orient your volunteers? A lot of times orientation traditionally has taken place at the agency location. But we know with COVID, this may be taking place online now, which is totally fine. And it's, whatever works best for your organization and could potentially change depending on what's going on, with the world and with our work. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into training. I'm also trying to be very conscious of time. We have a little less than 15 minutes left. I'm pretty sure we can do it. So bear with me. So steps to developing training. We're going to go into each of these, but step 1 is identifying what the training needs are. Step 2 is designing the training. Step 3 is delivering the training. And then step 4 is assessing and refining the training once you've given the training. So if we take a look at how to identify training needs, there are 3 buckets that you want to consider. So the first is knowledge. So what do the volunteers need to know in order to be successful and effective volunteers? The second is skills. What skills and abilities do the volunteers need to complete this specific volunteer task? And then finally, what perspectives or personality traits should the volunteer have? And so this goes back to what I said earlier, where you don't necessarily want to place an introverted, more quiet individual in a position where they are outward facing and have to be friendly and outgoing and interact with the general public on a daily basis. It just may not be a good fit for them and they may not thrive in that position. So really considering an individual's perspectives and personality traits and how that will relate back to what you're asking that volunteer to do. Now, step 2, training or designing training. So when you design training, you want to think about these principles as you are figuring out what components to include. So the first is you want to make sure that the training is relevant to what the volunteer will be doing. So it demonstrates the immediate value. So the volunteers understand, oh, this is why they're telling me this. Because there's nothing worse than learning something that you'll then never have to use. That actually, to me, feels like school in a nutshell. A lot of learning about things or math that I never used, but I had to learn anyway. So in your trainings, you want to make sure that the volunteer understands why they're learning what they're learning and how it will be applied. And then also the training should help them solve problems. So if they get into a situation, they should already know how to handle that situation. Obviously, the first few times they may need assistance, but eventually once they get experience, they'll know exactly how to handle different situations based on the training they received from you. And then, as I've mentioned, even in these trainings, you want to be interactive. So build on the participants' experiences, communicate key message through different modes. That's why I try to build in polls and discussion points and breakout rooms, because not everyone learns the same. And I don't want to sit here and talk at you for 2 hours. So that's why it's really important to use different methods of delivering training. And then finally, allow for participants to apply learning. So this is my least favorite activity, and I know a lot of people feel this way too, but sometimes role playing when you are training a volunteer on how to do something is really effective. But also even asking volunteers questions and putting them in a situational perspective. So you can ask a volunteer, all right, based on the training you've received so far, if you were in this experience or this situation with a client, how would you handle it based on the training that you received today. And then that way the volunteer can take what they've learned, apply it to a potential real life situation. And in that moment, you can provide feedback and let them know which aspects of their response were spot on and which ones could use a little bit of work. Step 3, so delivering the training. So there are 4 considerations that you want to think about when figuring out how you want to deliver the training. So the first is when. So one thing you'll see in all of these answers is convenience. So not just convenient for you, but also for the volunteer. And that's a big thing, like convenience. Honestly, like as much as it sounds like, oh, convenient, like that doesn't really matter. It's really important because that's actually could be a big barrier to getting volunteers in the door if you're not considering the convenience of access to your training. So when to deliver the training, when it's convenient to both you and the volunteer, before it's needed. I would hate to put a volunteer in a position where they have to solve a problem that I have not yet given them the training on. And then also when volunteers are most open to it. So for example, you might not want to give an in-depth training on a specific volunteer project to a volunteer that hasn't yet committed to that specific opportunity. This really goes back to like how you market your message, where you are kind of giving them the overview. And then once they opt in is when you do that intense, very specific training on how to do that opportunity. Consideration 2 is where to deliver the training. So again, somewhere convenient. And that might be online, that might be at your agency location, it might be, at a community center, just really thinking about where would be convenient for you and the volunteer, and also somewhere comfortable. There's a lot of considerations with that, but really just considering the environment, especially if it's going to be a longer training, our volunteer is going to have to sit in uncomfortable chairs for 2 hours. And just, considering the volunteer at that point and how easy it will be with them to listen and participate in the training that you're offering. Who will deliver the training? So you want to have someone who is a content expert and possibly also someone who is competent in both training and knowledge about your information. This may be one person, it may be multiple people, and that is okay to include multiple people within one training. For our 211 volunteer program training, it is a partnership between 2 engagement staff members. So we do more of like the volunteer perspective and manage the experience, while we rely on our 211 call center staff to give the technical aspect of the training. So don't like feel weird or feel bad about having to bring in different people for different skills for the training. It'd actually be more effective for the volunteer if you need to bring in other people to assist, and that's totally fine. And then finally, how the training will be conducted. So if possible, it's always best to use various methods. So some volunteers may be able to doing training in person, while some may be better doing training on their own or virtually. Obviously, there's a lot of considerations that go into how, especially in the COVID pandemic. So that's another thing that we'd be happy to chat through with you on if you had questions about how to kind of overhaul how you're giving training, especially in a virtual capacity. We'd be happy to help with that. But also be interactive. Again, it goes back to, you don't want to sit there and just talk at volunteers for 2 hours. You want them to be able to participate, share their experiences, and feel like they had a worthwhile experience. So being interactive is really important as well. Now, this slide I am not going to go into. I'm actually going to send an article afterwards that really goes into detail on each of these training methods, but I just wanted to put it out there that depending on the type of training you're hoping to offer, there are different types of trainings that fit more with like a formal or more casual kind of atmosphere. And also it may depend on the individual you're training as well. So you can see on here, there's a wide variety of types of training, where some are instructor led, some are self-paced, some are peer supported. So again, I'm not going to deep dive into these now, but I will share the article so you can take a look at all the different types and kind of identify which ones may be best for your organization. And then finally, the last step is assessing and refining training. So one thing you always want to do is, after you complete a training, I go back and figure out if there are things that you can improve upon. I can tell you right now, there's a lot of different things I can improve upon in this training. I think it was good. Hopefully you did too. But there's always things that can be done better, information that can be shared in a more clear way, or just different information that can be shared. So some of the ways in which you can get feedback to assess your training is getting written participant evaluations. So for example, you will be receiving a virtual or an online survey that I really hope you fill out, because I want to make these trainings the best they can be for all of you. So please, it's like a 3-minute survey just to get your feedback on how it was, any suggestions. So that's a great thing to use. You could do a reflection exercise at the end of training to get real-time feedback. You can check in with volunteers throughout to see how they're feeling as you go through training, and then also performance evaluations as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can assess and then make changes to your training as you move forward. So we are at the end of training. I know that was a ton of information. We covered a lot of different things. As I mentioned, we are going to be sending a recording of the PowerPoint as well as supplemental materials. Matt and I are also here to chat with you if you want to set up something individually with us and talk through some more concepts, help, we can help you problem solve, whatever that might be. So I just wanted to take a moment. Feel free to either drop this in the chat or come off of mute, but maybe think of either an aha moment and or aha moment that you had. So an aha moment would be ideas that clicked, made sense, or even prompted new ideas for you to take back to your organization. So I'd love to hear if there was anything that you were like, yes, this is awesome. I'm going to take this piece of information back to my organization. Or even if there were certain concepts that either you were feeling like you're a little bit confused about or don't, fully understand or want more information on, if you could either share those in the chat or go ahead and come off of mute just for the last couple of minutes. I'd love to hear if there is anything that was really great or something you'd like more information on.
Hi, my name is Wendy and I'm with the Capuchin Soup Kitchen. And I am curious to know if you or anyone else that's on this Zoom call knows what the psychology is behind people that reach out to your organization stating that they're interested in volunteering. They go through the sign-up process as far as creating a profile in our volunteer management system, and then they never volunteer.
That is, I laugh because in my 13 years, that is still a problem that I've personally not figured out, is why people go through a huge effort to participate, including with our 2-in-1 program. We will have folks literally complete a background check, do 3 hours of training, take a quiz, and then they never volunteer. And I don't understand. But I will absolutely see what I can find on that. If anyone has any resources, feel free to come on and share or drop in the chat, but I will take a look and see if I can find anything, and I will share that with you.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of folks want more information on DEI training. Absolutely. I think that is something that we're all very focused on, something that's very prevalent and top of mind for us. So I will not only make sure to share that with folks in the email afterwards to say, share what you're doing on DEI training, but I will also keep you updated and share some resources from our perspective as well. Is there anyone else that wants to share before we hop off for today? Yes, info on the volunteer portal. Absolutely. We will definitely send that as well. So thank you for putting that in there.
Kristen, I'll mention too, I know United Way here, we have over the last year created a diversity, equity, inclusion department, and they're working on a more comprehensive training, both with our own staff and with an external organization to offer different trainings to organizations. So not just around volunteerism, but how to incorporate DEI into all of our work here in the nonprofit and related sectors. That is a little bit of a ways off still, but that's something to look on the horizon as a resource coming out of United Way to help all of our partners out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, one thing I will say too is I actually connected with one of you a couple of days ago with some resources on DEI information that you can share with volunteers directly. So I will also share those resources. And yes, absolutely. So someone in the chat asked, can you send this presentation so you can share with staff? 100%. I will absolutely do that. I will also share the link for our next training to register, which will be back or not back. It will be in October. So if anyone wants to stay on and ask questions of Matt or I will hang out for a couple minutes, but otherwise we are all set today. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope that you found this beneficial, and we will be in touch soon with more information. Thank you all.
Thank you.